October 1983. Tension along the Iron Curtain is at its peak. NATO has initiated a high-tempo readiness drill, and in the Soviet General Staff War Room, the atmosphere is razor-thin. An encrypted flash message arrives from Soviet surveillance satellites. U.S. ballistic missile submarines have shifted formation in the Atlantic. It could be a drill, or it could be a prelude. The Kremlin won't take chances. At 02:02 Moscow time, a coded message goes out: initiate coordinated readiness maneuvers. Submarine fleets, long-range bomber wings, and mobile missile units across 4 time zones receive the command, and that's when the timeline begins to fracture. In the Belarusian military district, crews begin warming up their TLs. Transporter erector launchers synchronized perfectly to the Moscow coded timestamp. But 900 kilometers east, in the Volga region, crews are already rolling 43 minutes ahead of schedule. Their orders came through 2Z0 as well, but on a map stamped in local time. In the Pacific Fleet, a nuclear submarine delays departure from dock. Its mission window was listed as 04:15, but the navigators used UTC. By the time they convert, their satellite coverage window has passed. In Kaliningrad, a long-range missile regiment prepares to load warheads. The schedule calls for 0-hour readiness at 03:30. But that's 03:30 Moscow time. Their local clock reads 01:30. They wait. For 17 minutes, the Soviet Union's most powerful military branches are out of sync. Some are early, some are late. None of them realize the others are operating on different clocks. The command system doesn't register an error. The missile crews don't miss a beat. The submarines move, but out of cadence. The warheads are ready, but not aligned with the launch windows. One blundered order away from escalation. The Soviet Union is mobilizing into chaos. In Moscow, a general slammed the table. Why is Kaliningrad not ready? Why is Saratov already moving? Who authorized the discrepancy's silence? And then a lieutenant from the mapping division, pale as the floodlights, mutters, "Sir, they're reading different clocks." A pause, a slow, horrified realization. The Soviet military, hypercentralized, nuclear-armed, synchronized to the second, has no single time standard. And for 17 minutes, a misprinted timestamp on a folded map almost started a war. Inside the war-fogged bureaucracy of the Soviet military, one assumption had been sacrosanct for decades: everyone used Moscow time. It was more than a convenience, it was a symbol of unity, central control, and ideological discipline. From Murmansk to Vladivostok, orders flowed outward from the Kremlin like clockwork, each tied to the capital's hour. Every missile protocol, every fleet maneuver, every satellite pass Moscow time was law, or so they believed. What no one realized until that October night was that the foundation of this rigidly orchestrated war machine had a fatal crack: the maps. Military cartography in the USSR was a fragmented empire. Over the years, different cartographic institutes, topographical divisions, and Warsaw Pact contractors had all contributed to the production of field maps. Some were legacy formats from the 1950s. Others had been hastily produced during modernization efforts in the 70s. Each division issued their own, some marked explicitly in Moscow time, others in local time, a few even labeled in UTC for international coordination drills. But there was no centralized enforcement, no mandatory overlay, no red line warning. These times are not the same. Worse still, the maps looked identical. One officer could open a deployment schedule marked 02:00 and think he had 2 hours. Another, reading the exact same number from a different zone, believed the time had already passed. No one questioned it. Why would they commanders trusted the cartographic legends. Crews followed what was printed. Field officers confirmed synchronization, verbally never realizing they were agreeing on different frames of reference. It wasn't incompetence. It was a procedural illusion, a system so confident in its own standardization that it never bothered to check if standardization actually existed. For years, this time drift had gone unnoticed. Drills that ran slightly early or late were blamed on terrain, radio delay, or human hesitation. Until 1983, when NATO's Able Archer simulation triggered full Soviet strategic mobilization readiness. Suddenly, exact seconds mattered. Launch windows were paired to satellite overpasses. Submarine movements were clocked to orbital intelligence drops. Strategic bombers had to be airborne at precise intervals to avoid detection. And when they weren't, finger-pointing began. But the equipment worked. The troops complied. The clocks ran fine. What didn't match the paper guiding them? That was the room of wrong assumptions, a command structure that trusted its charts more than its clocks, that built precision into its weapons but left vagueness in its maps, a military that believed it could measure war to the second, while its armies ran on different hours. To the outside world, Soviet military doctrine in the 1980s appeared brutally efficient. It was a war machine engineered to function like a Swiss watch, except it was nuclear-powered, deeply secretive, and timed to obliterate NATO in under 72 hours. Every Soviet combat operation hinged on one principle: synchronized execution. The Soviets didn't believe in decentralization. From the smallest artillery battery to the strategic rocket forces, all action flowed from the top. Coordinated waves of missile strikes, airborne assaults, armor thrusts. Timing was everything. It was doctrine written into the bone of their war planning. Missile launches required exact satellite confirmation windows. Submarine operations used synchronized acoustic silence protocols. Bomber wings flying toward Western Europe were calculated to arrive within minutes of theater-wide jamming campaigns. The first salvo would stun, the second would destroy. This wasn't theory. It was procedure, tested endlessly in war games, and it all depended on one unspoken truth. Every unit was using the same clock. There were no fallback measures, no secondary verification, no universal time conversion standards between districts. That wasn't necessary because every printed order was assumed to be in Moscow time, except not all of them were. Some units near the eastern borders had requested maps in local time to reduce conversion errors during border patrol missions. Others, participating in Warsaw Pact drills, received materials printed in East Germany using Central European time. A handful of missile regiments with orbital support had maps labeled in Zulu UTC to coordinate with early reconnaissance satellites. And yet, during a real crisis, those units would be expected to act in unison. No one had noticed the mismatch because the doctrine didn't allow for doubt. You didn't question the timing. You followed orders. If your orders said prepare to fire at 0300, you prepped at 0300 on your watch. It worked until the system scaled beyond its assumptions. And the cracks began to show. In a simulated full-scale mobilization, one missile crew began prepping warheads early because their maps were printed in Moscow time but read by a local time crew. At the same moment, a submarine held station, waiting for a signal that had already passed. Further west, a bomber regiment reported ready status after the joint strike window had expired. No enemy had fired a shot. But inside the Soviet machine, chaos was taking root. Not because the enemy was fast, but because the Soviets couldn't agree on what time it was. The spark didn't come from NATO, it came from inside the Soviet Union. November 6th, 1983. As part of the massive response drill codenamed Oseni-Ugan Autumn Intercept, the 43rd Rocket Army in Ukraine and the 31st Submarine Division in Kamchatka were both ordered to raise alert levels and prepare for synchronized nuclear response simulations. The key objective validates Soviet readiness to deliver a theater-scale retaliatory strike within a 20-minute window. That window was everything. Each strategic unit was assigned a precise time slot down to the second. Satellite confirmation passes had been timed to those slots. Radio silence zones were mapped. Support assets were staged. A single mistake would break the chain. At 03:14 Moscow time, the 43rd Rocket Army began prepping its intermediate-range missiles. Warheads were unlocked from their vaults. Crews initiated launch calibration protocols. Everything was on time. But in Kamchatka, the Pacific Fleet's strategic submarines were quiet. They weren't late. They were reading the same timestamp in local time, 9 hours ahead of Moscow. They believed they had nearly half a day before readiness was required. When a confirmation ping failed to arrive on schedule, one captain, thinking Moscow had delayed the sequence, stood down the crew. That delay triggered a cascade. An airborne command post circling over the Urals detected the timing discrepancy and initiated a secondary signal burst to force synchronization. But their message reached the Baltic region 7 minutes after the 1st Missile Regiment had completed pre-launch activation. Two completely unrelated timeframes were now feeding opposite inputs into the system. And it was about to get worse. In Belarus, a short-range nuclear artillery brigade was staged for a separate mobility drill. Their maps had been printed by a Polish contractor and labeled in Central European time. When their command received the launch readiness time of 04:30, they assumed it was local to them, not Moscow. They loaded their warheads 1 hour ahead of schedule. In that moment, across the Soviet Union, 3 separate time zones were being treated as the same clock. The Soviet system wasn't facing enemy jamming. It wasn't under cyber attack. It hadn't been hacked. It was breaking itself with perfect obedience to conflicting data. One high-speed flash message, sent from a Soviet orbital relay, passed through 2 districts with different map legends and was interpreted as 2 separate commands. The only thing that stopped a catastrophic misalignment cloud cover. Satellites missed their targeting windows. Orbital delays bought the system time to breathe. Confused commanders paused for clarity rather than continue blind. And somewhere in the Kremlin, a staff colonel realized we're not being attacked. We're just not telling time the same way. At 04:12 Moscow time, the Situation Room beneath the General Staff Headquarters descended into an unfamiliar silence. Not the silence of discipline, but of disbelief. The reports didn't match. Not one of them. Strike confirmation times varied by the hour. Readiness reports contradicted satellite pass logs. Some units had already stood down. Others were requesting confirmation for a launch sequence that had expired 90 minutes earlier. The central war clock mounted over the wall-length operations map kept ticking forward. But across the USSR, its meaning fractured. The High Command responded the only way they knew how, with anger. The Far East Command was grilled. Why did you miss the launch window? The Belarusian staff were reprimanded. Who authorized early loading, the 43rd Rocket Army's operations officer, was told, point blank, you are either lying or insubordinate. But none of them had disobeyed. Each had followed the orders. Each had executed the schedule, printed on their regional maps, down to the second. It was the maps that didn't agree. But in Moscow, that answer wasn't acceptable. A senior general banged the table during the debrief. Maps are standardized. Time zones are irrelevant in a unified command. It wasn't ignorance. It was dogma. Soviet war planning was designed around centralization, a top-down cascade of obedience that left no room for doubt. Admitting that a missile unit in the Far East had interpreted a timestamp differently from one in Ukraine was like admitting the entire synchronization doctrine was built on sand. An aide suggested map inconsistencies might be the issue. He was silenced immediately. Instead, the General Staff clung to their preferred explanation, human error. The commands had been correct. The troops had misunderstood. A retraining order was drafted by midnight, but a young logistics officer, new to staff rotation, buried beneath stacks of printouts, did what no one else had done. He compared the actual maps, one from the 31st Submarine Division, one from the 43rd Rocket Army, one from the Baltic Theater. Each showed the same readiness order. Each used a different time standard, and none of them warned the reader. He flagged it, highlighted the inconsistency, and passed it to his superior. Hours later, a colonel carried the printouts into the Kremlin's internal security chamber and whispered the phrase no one wanted to hear. They're not using the same clock. That one sentence undid everything the Soviets believed about their readiness doctrine. It wasn't a communications failure. It wasn't sabotage. It was a belief failure, a faith in standardization that hadn't actually existed for decades. And in that moment, the Soviet General Staff finally realized they'd built a war machine so precise it was blind to its own errors. Even with the logistics officer's discovery in hand, Moscow refused to shift blame to the system itself. A new explanation emerged, one that kept the illusion of infallibility intact. The problem wasn't the maps, it was the men reading them. Within hours, the Ministry of Defense released a classified directive. All regional commands were to undergo immediate refreshers training on time zone conversion procedures. The issue, the memo insisted, stemmed from field misinterpretation of centralized synchronization data. It was an elegant lie, one that let the system survive without admitting the flaw was systemic. Commanders were ordered to standardize all operations under Moscow time moving forward, with verbal affirmations required during transmission. But nothing changed in the printed documents, the maps, or the operational legends. The same old cartographic templates continued circulating. Some marked MSK, others with no zone indicated at all. What had nearly caused a strategic-level error wasn't removed. It was buried beneath more rules. On the surface, things calmed. Units resumed drills, satellites realigned their orbits, warhead crews resumed routine checks. But among the ranks, trust had fractured. Officers began photocopying their maps and writing Moscow time in red ink across the timestamps. Others held briefings before exercises, double-checking that everyone used the same reference. Quiet precautions in a system that officially claimed no mistake had ever occurred. Behind closed doors, some staffers joked about it. Comrade. Next time we'll need a cosmonaut to tell us what time it is. But the laughter was hollow. Because the unspoken truth lingered, the Soviet military had no system for confirming the time standard across districts. Not in real time, not during drills, and certainly not under pressure. And worse, no one had thought to check before. Why? Because everyone assumed the doctrine was perfect. That Moscow's command flowed downward with mechanical precision. That time, like ideology, was absolute. But in reality, time had become relative and no one noticed until it nearly turned a drill into a disaster. The retraining sessions came and went. Official compliance reports were filed. Awards were handed out to district commanders for resilience during synchronization testing. But the real fix, the dangerous, foundational fix, was never implemented. Maps weren't recalled. Templates weren't standardized. And the people in charge of war didn't want to talk about the thing that almost started a one, because the true problem wasn't confusion. It was certainty in a system that refused to admit it could be wrong. If the first explanation was human error, the second was far more sinister and far more dangerous. Within days of the time zone debacle, a rumor began circulating inside the Soviet signals intelligence community. Perhaps the discrepancies weren't internal mistakes at all, but external sabotage. The theory, whispered in classified briefings and suggested in back-channel memos, was that NATO had begun manipulating time-synchronized signals to scramble Soviet coordination. Satellite relay delays, they argued, could be spoofed. Electromagnetic pulses could desynchronize ground-based clocks. Even false timestamps could be embedded in map imagery using advanced photographic techniques. The KGB latched onto the idea almost instantly. Suddenly, the narrative shifted from self-examination to enemy interference. A full-scale counterintelligence probe was launched. Satellite telemetry logs were combed. Communications between Warsaw Pact mapping contractors were audited. American GPS signals, still emerging as a global standard, were analyzed for temporal deviation vectors. To most officers, it was nonsense, but politically, it served a purpose. Blaming the West preserved the illusion of Soviet perfection. If NATO had tricked their timing, then Soviet units hadn't failed, they'd been attacked. If synchronization collapsed, it was the result of a new American weapon, a weapon that manipulated time itself. This theory led to absurd outcomes. One signals regiment in Kazakhstan began covering their radio towers with reflective foil, claiming it would block foreign time waves. Another command post in Siberia shut down satellite feeds entirely, operating only on hardwired internal clocks, which had already proven unreliable. No one asked the obvious. Why would NATO, in peacetime, simulate a temporal attack that didn't cause actual damage? The answer was simpler and far more terrifying, because the danger hadn't come from NATO at all. It came from inside a bureaucracy that had grown too complex to see its own contradictions. A war machine built on synchronization, yet unable to define synchronization across its own theaters. Still, the paranoia served its purpose. The second wrong theory gave the General Staff political cover. A secret memo issued weeks later concluded that external interference may have contributed to time mismatches. No evidence was cited. But the implications were clear. Training would continue. Doctrine would remain unchanged. Surveillance would increase. Truth had been displaced by the need for narrative control, because to accept the real failure that the Soviet military used maps that disagreed on what time it was meant confronting a deeper horror that their entire system had been pointing missiles at the world. While no one really knew when, the reckoning came not with a bang, but with a binder. In early 1984, following persistent inconsistencies in readiness drills, the Soviet Ministry of Defense initiated a quiet internal audit of cartographic production across the USSR and its allied states. The objective was simple: determine the origin of the timestamp discrepancies. The findings were anything but simple. Over 3,200 distinct map templates were in active circulation across Soviet forces, produced by no fewer than 11 separate bureaus, including military, civilian, and foreign partners within the Warsaw Pact. Each had its own labeling conventions, coordinate notations, and most critically, time references. Some maps used MSK Moscow Standard Time explicitly. Others had only numerical designators with no zone listed. A significant portion produced for joint operations in East Germany used CET Central European Time as their baseline, Maps printed in the Far East defaulted to local Vladivostok time, marked only with a regional offset, and at least 200 classified map sets, built for coordinating with space-based reconnaissance, were based entirely on UTC Greenwich Mean Time. There was no master list, no central authority verifying uniformity. Even worse, mobile units often carried mixed sets. A mobile missile launcher could have one deployment map printed in Moscow, another produced by a Polish liaison unit, and a strike window map sourced from a satellite reconnaissance kit, each referencing a different time standard. If the crews didn't cross-check manually, and they rarely had time to, they'd simply follow the timestamp in front of them. The audit uncovered 23 separate incidents over the previous 3 years where drills had been misaligned due to undocumented time zone misreads. None had resulted in disaster. All had been chalked up to local procedural confusion. Not a single one had been escalated as a systemic failure. The intelligence services had no idea. GRU analysts had been feeding operational models based on assumed synchronization, target acquisition rates, strike response curves, satellite coordination, all built on the illusion of a universal clock that didn't exist. When the results were delivered to the general staff, they were not printed. They were hand-copied, sealed, and entered into the vault system as infrastructural anomaly summaries. The fear wasn't just tactical, it was existential. If the Soviet military couldn't synchronize its own units in peacetime, how could it coordinate a global first strike? If a timestamp on a missile launch schedule could mean 5 different things, what did that say about command integrity? And if the Americans had known, what would they have done? The Soviets had always feared a decapitation strike. An enemy move so fast, so precise, it left them no time to react. Now, they realized something worse, that even if they had time, they might not know what time it was. While Soviet forces struggled in silence across the Atlantic, the United States had already faced and solved the problem years earlier. As early as 1960, following multiple close calls during joint exercises with NATO partners, the U.S. Department of Defense had made a critical decision: every military branch, unit, and operation, regardless of location, would operate on a single global standard Zulu Time, Coordinated Universal Time, UTC. It wasn't a suggestion. It was law. From nuclear submarines prowling the Arctic, to bomber squadrons in Guam, to intelligence analysts in Colorado, every timestamp, every missile sequence, every launch window was clocked against the same reference. It didn't matter what your local time was. In the American system, only Zulu time mattered. That decision reshaped everything. U.S. war maps carried no ambiguity. The time zones were never printed as local. Instead, every order, every chart, every satellite image bore a single notation, Z. It was built into software, into checklists, into the very speech of radio transmissions. Execute at 0400 Zulu. No room for confusion, no math, no assumptions. This standardization came at a cost. Crews had to memorize conversions. Officers had to adapt their habits. But the result was a strategic machine that could coordinate across the globe without ever asking what time it was in Munich, Tokyo, or Anchorage. The Navy trained sailors to think in Zulu time. Air Force strike teams rehearsed launch protocols with watches set to UTC, not local base time. Even National Security Council briefings were time-stamped in Zulu, even if the president himself preferred Eastern. That discipline bore fruit. In 1976, during a complex 3-theater joint drill simulating a Soviet first strike, UN response units achieved total synchronization submarines, missile silos, and airborne command centers within a 2-second global margin. The Soviets, by contrast, never achieved better than a 12-minute margin on their own territory. And those 12 minutes weren't due to lack of speed. They were due to inconsistent time references across maps, systems, and districts. The Americans understood something the Soviets hadn't yet grasped. That war isn't just about firepower. It's about timing. And timing depends on trust. Not in people, but in a single clock. Ironically, the U.S. had learned this not from conflict, but from aviation accidents, civilian and military, where unclear timestamps had led to fatal miscommunications. From those tragedies, the military built a new culture, one where no one acted until the time was crystal clear. The Soviet system prized speed and central control. The American system prized consistency and redundancy. And in the split-second world of nuclear strategy, that consistency wasn't just a bureaucratic preference, it was survival. Because in a war measured in megatons and milliseconds, what mattered most wasn't range, payload, or targeting, but whether every trigger, everywhere, meant the same second. And in 1983, the Americans had that. The Soviets didn't. The Soviet military couldn't bury this one under protocol. After the audit, after the quiet panic in the general staff, after the failed simulations and the near miss of strategic disaster, someone had to take the fall. But no one wanted to admit the truth. That would mean rewriting maps, retraining every unit, recalibrating satellite doctrine, and worst of all, admitting that the Americans had solved it first. So the response was surgical. 3 senior cartographic officers were reassigned for health reasons. A directive was issued to streamline time zone references in future maps, with no mention of what had occurred. One internal memo, stamped eyes only, recommended burning all legacy map stock with ambiguous time data. That recommendation was never followed. Instead, the humiliation was turned inward. Commanders who had acted on bad information were reprimanded for lack of operational discipline. A submarine captain who delayed departure due to conflicting timestamps was rotated out of theater. His personnel file was marked hesitation during alert condition. The officer who discovered the time zone inconsistency reassigned to logistics training, far from the general staff. The message was clear: the system couldn't fail. Only the people inside it could. But within the ranks, the whispers started. Drill masters began taping Zulu conversions onto briefing room walls. Junior officers carried laminated time zone charts in their uniform pockets. In underground bunkers, some crews stopped trusting printed timestamps altogether, waiting for verbal confirmation before acting. And yet, the maps remained. Every day, missile units ran drills using coordinates tied to a clock that might not match the one next door. Pilots flew with flight plans labeled in time zones they didn't recognize. Submarines received satellite updates that required quiet math under pressure. The humiliation wasn't just that the Americans had gotten it right, it was that Soviet pride wouldn't allow a fix. Admitting the problem would mean acknowledging that speed was not precision, that centralization was not clarity, that obedience without verification was not strength, it was vulnerability. And so, for all their power, all their readiness, all their missiles pointed west. The Soviet Union remained a superpower that couldn't tell you what time it was everywhere at once. Because even as their doctrine demanded second-by-second perfection, their system delivered parallel clocks, competing truths, and silence where correction should have lived. The battlefield had never even started, but the Soviet war machine had already lost the thing it prized most: control. For decades. Soviet military doctrine projected an image of absolute order chains of command etched in stone. Protocols designed to eliminate ambiguity. Missiles timed to the second. The Soviet Union did not improvise. It synchronized. But the map time debacle shattered that illusion. It wasn't just a technical oversight. It was an ideological crack in the foundation. Because time, like doctrine, like truth, was supposed to flow from the center, from Moscow, from the party, from the system. Instead, the Soviet Union had discovered that even its most sacred metric when to act was fragmented. This wasn't a failure of hardware. It wasn't a sabotage campaign. It wasn't human error. It was systemic blindness, a doctrine that presumed compliance without verification, a belief that printing the order meant understanding it, a war machine that never asked whether its own clocks were in sync because the thought itself was heretical. In the aftermath, some reforms were attempted, but none touched the root. Why? Because acknowledging the flaw meant questioning the doctrine that centralized everything. If maps conflicted with orders, which would you change? The documents or the ideology that produced them? The answer, for the Soviet High Command, was neither. They chose silence. And that silence metastasized. It showed up again in 1987 when a radar station misinterpreted a NATO exercise timing window. It crept into submarine operations where launch windows failed to align with overpass data. It even infected civilian infrastructure delays in emergency response traced back to misread dispatch timestamps. Each time, the root cause was obscured because to admit that the Soviet war machine couldn't agree on time was to admit it couldn't be trusted with timing. And in the realm of nuclear deterrence, that was fatal. The American doctrine rooted in redundancy and self-auditing allowed for friction because it assumed systems fail. The Soviet doctrine demanded perfection and collapsed when perfection was exposed as myth. This was the strategic collapse. The realization that speed without clarity was danger, that synchronization without confirmation was delusion, that maps drawn with pride could just as easily draw disaster. And so, the system continued forward, still powerful, still immense but hollowed, a war machine pretending it still moved in unison, while deep inside, no one could say exactly when or whether the countdown had already started. Today, those maps sit sealed in Soviet-era cabinets yellowing under glass, time-stamped, folded along creases worn by trembling fingers. Some are labeled MSK, others carry no time zone at all. A few are printed in Polish, Czech, even German relics of a Warsaw Pact long dissolved. But the fear remains. Veterans who served during the incident rarely speak of it. When they do, it's in half jokes about drills run too early, radios crackling off cue, launch teams staring at blank skies while the war that never came passed them by. You can hear it in the stories we were ready to fire, but no one else moved. Our clocks said go, their clocks said wait. The war didn't need NATO. We could have started it ourselves. Because that's the real ghost of the Cold War, not just the missiles that never launched, but the seconds that almost triggered them, measured by maps that didn't agree, clocks that weren't aligned, and orders that no longer meant the same thing across the vast empire they governed. In the post-Soviet era, Russia standardized time coordination across its armed forces. But the scars remain. Every modern Russian command system now begins with a question once unthinkable in the Soviet Union. What time is your clock set to? Because the lesson was burned into the system in silence. It doesn't take war to start disaster. Just a disagreement about when to act. And all it takes to destroy the illusion of control is a piece of paper that says 02 or 0 in the wrong hands. If this story made you rethink how war, control, and coordination really work, Subscribe to this channel. We break down Cold War systems every day, exposing how ideology, error, and blind trust nearly brought the world to the edge. Hit the bell, join the mission, because in the end, it wasn't the missiles that failed, it was the map.